You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we explore the importance of our national parks and historic sites with those who live and work in them every day. We'll learn about history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Ranger Eric Leonard, Superintendent of Minuteman Missile National Historic Site, just north of Badlands National Park.
What does it mean to be an American? How do we defend this country? And the answer to that question, when you're standing at Delta 9 looking down, you're in this beautiful landscape. The meadowlarks are singing, the Badlands are in the distance, and then you look down and there's this concrete and steel, ultra-modern thing that housed a weapon.
Stay tuned. We'll take a look into the Cold War and discuss tensions with the USSR that led to the creation of a nuclear arsenal just beneath the plains of South Dakota. If you've been enjoying our podcast, we hope to keep this show on the road with your support. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. Other levels get bonus episodes, invites to hike with us, and more. To join our exclusive community, check out our Patreon page in the show notes or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. At this point in our podcasts, you're usually hearing a story from us. This time, we want to get a bit more personal and real, because today's subject matter will be difficult for some. The National Parks system covers over 400 sites, and they range from places of immense beauty to places of immense pain and sorrow. Minuteman Missile National Historic Site covers the topic of nuclear war. This was a difficult episode to edit. I mean, we're talking about a nuclear arsenal right beneath the Great Plains, which still exists today, though on a much smaller scale than it did during the Cold War. In fact, for many of you, the Cold War is not a distant memory. Some of you experienced nuclear strike drills in school. Duck, cover, and don't look at the flash. We do our best not to dwell on modern politics, but our national parks are inherently political. It would be a disservice to the park system if we didn't cover the hard topics, along with the wonderful ones. We hope today's episode will encourage some introspection and help you discover why we preserve controversial places like this. To learn more about Minuteman Missile and the Cold War, we sit down with Superintendent Eric Leonard.
Welcome to Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. We're sitting in the day room of the Launch Control Facility at Delta 1. And the park, of course, commemorates the land-based intercontinental ballistic Minuteman system developed during the Cold War as a critical part of America's triad of nuclear deterrence created during the Cold War as nuclear weapons developed following 1945.
Eric spent the first few years of his life growing up in the national park system, which would inspire him to follow in his father's footsteps later in life.
My father was a junior high life science teacher for 30 years, but the first 7 summers of my life, he was also a seasonal ranger naturalist at the Canyon District in Yellowstone National Park. And so many of my earliest memories are being a ranger kid where, living in a place where people come for fun. And that's a really good introduction to running a place where people come for fun.
His career in the national parks began much the same way as many park rangers we've had on this show, as a seasonal.
I've been here for 3 years. I started in college as a seasonal, not an unusual formal start to a career in the summer of 1995 at another Great Plains park, south of us by about 8 hours, a place called Fort Larned National Historic Site in western Kansas.
Through his career, he found himself working with the very people he looked up to growing up as a kid.
Most of my first heroes when I was 4 or 5 years old were the rangers my dad worked with, a couple of whom I've had the good fortune to work with in my career. And that's both a little weird and kind of amazing.
So you're the superintendent of the missile.
Indeed.
You have been for 3 years now?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, before we get into the history of the place, if you could just give us a quick overview of what your role entails as superintendent?
Superintendent, on the one hand, they're the person in charge.
Sure.
But what does that really mean? We're hiring someone today, we're saying goodbye to someone today, and I didn't do those things. The staff that work with me did those things. And the superintendent is responsible for ensuring that federal rules, laws and regulations are followed, that the taxpayer funds that are provided to us for projects or our operational base funding is properly expended. If something goes wrong, the superintendent is the responsible party. And you're the caretaker of all of this, of whatever this is. And every park is different, but what they have in common is each is very special, often very specialized in terms of what the resource is, what the very specific challenges are in that place. There's this dichotomy within the national park system. Every park is different and special and independent to certain degrees, but they're part of a larger thing. Yeah. And sometimes the actions we do for the good of the service are the most important things we do.
So your role here is, we've actually heard in a previous episode, in episode 3, one of our rangers told us about the superintendent used to be called the steward. Yeah. So I think that's very fitting as steward of this site.
Yeah, and the former director of the National Park Service, John Jarvis, the phrase he used that I like just because I think it's very simple. We're in the forever business. We can quote the Organic Act, but we're in the forever business. Our job is to preserve this place so that my children can bring their children here a generation from now, and it will still look like it's 1993 and everybody just stepped out for a minute.
Yeah.
and that's, it's a fun challenge in this particular place. And again, the superintendent at a different park will have, they're in the forever business. They're trying to the best of their ability to keep the place the way it is in a very dynamic and complex world.
Yeah. So it does look like they may have just stepped out in the 90s. I think a good job has been done. And I don't know if we really discussed it too much on the record officially, but where are we right now? We're in
the day room of the launch control facility, Delta One. And the launch control facility, it's a several acre compound with a fence. One of the ways we describe this for visitors coming in from the highway is look for the paranoid rancher's house, because it's the topside structure is a long ranch style building inside a compound with 8-foot security fences and barbed wire and signs on the outside that say use of deadly force authorized. And so another consequence of that is even modern visitors, occasionally they're coming here for the tour and they know they're supposed to come here, and then they see those signs and it doesn't feel very welcoming. It wasn't supposed to.
Sure.
And again, I started my career at a frontier fort of the 1860s. This is a frontier fort of the 1960s. This little compound, for 30 years, at any time, there's 10 Air Force personnel here, and 8 of them work, the shorthand we use is topside. And they are enlisted personnel, mostly Air Force security police. And, so teenagers, 20-somethings with automatic weapons. And then there are 2 Air Force personnel officers who would work underground in the underground control center. And generalizing just a little bit, the topside crews usually worked 3-day rotations. The missile combat crew would come here in the morning and do a 24-hour alert, leave the next day. Right. And there's some variation over time to how that schedule worked too, but generally speaking, you did a 24-hour alert. And, well, the park preserves the missile, but what is the missile?
Yeah, so what is the missile?
The missile is, it's a land-based nuclear deterrent, but even what is that? Our story starts with a beep in October 1957, and that when the Soviet Union launches a rocket containing the world's first satellite into space. If they can do that, what else can they do? And by the late 1950s, nuclear weapons have had a growth decade where they've gone from very small yields of 15 to 20 kilotons, which is the size of the weapons used in Japan in 1945, to hundreds of kilotons or megatons. And the weapons of 1945 were incredibly destructive. By the time you get to 1 megaton, it's an entirely different magnitude. These weapons essentially erase cities from the face of the earth. Yeah. And in the 1940s and 50s, nuclear weapons would have been delivered only by one method: bombers, planes. But the thing about planes is they're coming. You got radar, and you can see them coming, you can respond. Yeah. Once it's a missile that's launched over the top of the Earth, if the missile going 15,000 miles an hour, has a flight time of 30 minutes, launched a target, by the time you've detected it, you may have 15 minutes before missiles are hitting the ground and destroying American cities, destroying American targets. And the missiles that were being developed were slow, they were liquid fuel. After Sputnik, the Air Force, the Eisenhower administration, they faced an existential crisis. America thought Soviets could destroy us at any time. Mm-hmm. And a secret development program was designed to create a missile that was faster, that was something that could be deployed in a mass arsenal. And that's the Minuteman. And those earlier missiles, Atlas, Titan, Nike, they use liquid fuels. They have, depending on, some of them have shorter ranges. What they really had was long response times, which prior to rockets and satellites wasn't a big deal. Mm-hmm. Once you have rockets, we have to be able to respond quickly. And the Minuteman missile uses a solid fuel. And, so the non-military reference is the American Space Shuttle. And from 1981 to 2011, the white rockets on the outside of that external tank when it launched, those are solid fuel. You light them and they don't stop until they run out of fuel. Mm-hmm. And they are fast. I mean, very, very fast. And that's what a Minuteman missile was. The part of the genius of this particular system, it was so over-engineered in the 1950s that we're still using it. We modernized bits and pieces of it, but the system as a whole hasn't changed much since its original design conception. It was so well-designed, so over-designed. And just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad. Mm-hmm. This was a system that was highly reliable. And the Cold War arsenal of Minuteman missiles, between 1960 and 1967, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Air Force built 6 missile fields in the United States, all but one of them in the upper northern Great Plains, and 1,000 missile silos, 100 control centers, keyed to 6 Air Force bases. They built this at the rate of essentially a silo a day.
Wow.
The control center, Delta 1, the name is very intentional. Delta 1 means it's part of a group of something. And mm-hmm. The Deltas 2 through 11 were the missile silos directly controlled by this facility. Mm-hmm. And they're part of a squadron of 50 silos. The control centers, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. Echo, north of Kadoka, was the squadron command post. And the missile officers, the missile combat crews, on the one hand, they're by themselves, team of 2 people underground, and yet they're not alone. There's 4 other groups of 2 in that squadron. And the initial structure of 10 is important. The Delta Control Center has control over those 10, but in a pinch, you could assume control of another flight within your squadron.
Right. And this was all to preserve sort of a redundancy.
Yes. And then the conception is it takes 2 people to turn keys and initiate a launch. Mm-hmm. Yes, but it takes 2 more.
Right.
You had to have at least one other control center to agree to the vote. And depending on the war plan, these missiles are sort of an all or nothing. The original conception is you're going 50 in the air mm-hmm. if you get a launch order. And over time that may change, or depending on the possible posture the president would have been given, they might have saved some back for a second retaliatory strike.
Right. Or targets may have shifted. Yeah. Okay. But either way you look at it, 2 votes from 2 different areas, and there's no going back.
And part of that, when you did a shift change down in the control center, you're signing paperwork that gives you operational responsibility for 10 nuclear weapons. Right. And again, as park superintendent that signs property paperwork is part of what I do.
Yeah.
A lot of my stuff is like computers or digital cameras. Well, or vehicles, and it's still government property, although it's a totally different kind of government property. Yeah. And in the top side, you have armed security police here. There was a locked weapons locker in the structure in this security control center that was loaded for bear. It had grenades, mm-hmm. multiple automatic weapons, lots of ammunition. They were ready to go. And those security police, there's 6 security police in the building at any time. It's 2 teams of 3, a flight security controller, 2 enlisted security police. And the security controller stays in the office. If there's an alarm out at one of the silos, you dispatch the team, and they're in a pickup or a Suburban with automatic weapons driving around the dirt roads of western South Dakota, at perhaps high speed to get out to a silo. And what are the alarms they're chasing? The intrusion alarms are so sensitive that jackrabbits set them off. And so
a lot
often,
of false alarms.
A lot of false alarms.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, when you're talking about weapons of this magnitude, you'd rather police every false alarm than miss something serious.
Oh, absolutely. You talked about the Cold War and how it kind of began to come about with the satellites being launched and Soviet Union's capabilities and the scare that it put into the Americans. So do we have a firm date? At what point do we officially enter the Cold War with the USSR? I think it's hotly debated, isn't it?
It is hotly debated. I would argue that there is no break between the World War II and the Cold War.
Yeah.
One ends, and the alliance that defeated the Nazis is already fraying. That all feed into this post-World War II binary order: the free countries, the communist countries. Yeah. And by 1947, there's great concern that the Soviet bloc countries are creating a series of totalitarian governments. The Iron Curtain immediately on the border of free countries in Europe. And if the Soviet military is putting tanks and armies in those countries, they could repeat history and wash across Europe.
Yeah.
And there's very heated rhetoric on both sides.
And that was late 40s generally is when we start into this sort of era commonly referred to as the Cold War. And
one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War is the nuclear weapon, the big stick, in a sense, a weapon that's so destructive. I mean, they are weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. Yeah. Their use is the threat, that we possess these, so don't attack us first. And that's why the Soviet Union wants nuclear weapons. But throughout the 1950s, once they both have them, they're both then trying to make them more powerful, smaller, easier to deliver all the time, and then they're trying to collect more of them.
All these weapons which you really don't want to use, and yet you're advancing by leaps and bounds in terms of capability.
And that's one of the many contradictions fraught within the story.
Right.
And that's what leads to the Minuteman system, that we have this arsenal. Another contradiction built into the system. So this is all built in the 1960s. The locals know where everything is. It's not a secret.
No, it's not.
But to the American public at large, once it's built, it's forgotten. This was a public works project, on a scale that it should be better known. I mean, we built 1,000 missile silos in less than 10 years from nothing. And then the other consequence of that is we put an arsenal next to American cities, next to American homes, next to American schools. Yeah. And generally speaking, we put them in rural areas, but people still lived around it. And now, if you're a rancher, how do you feel about contractors coming in and trenching communications cable lines across your field, or building a missile silo in your field? And you have no say in where stuff gets put.
Right.
And that created some tension.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine public opinion was a little tricky to navigate.
It exists, and yet the Soviets know where everything is. They have all the control centers targeted by the 1970s or 80s with 10 megaton warheads. 10 megatons is overkill, massive overkill.
Yeah,
it would erase this place, leave a 300-foot crater. And so born out of that contradiction, in the 1980s, you have, at most of the missile fields, you begin to have local anti-nuclear protests. And the most profound action that those protesters do in the 1980s is they map the missile fields and they publish it. And they say, the Soviets know where this is, Americans should know where it is too, and talk about what does this mean. And that's a reminder that none of this stuff existed in a vacuum. It was built and people reacted to it.
Yeah.
That said, at some point in the mid-'80s, and I can't honestly remember the year, as a teenager, Great Western Road trip, my family, we drove through, we did Mount Rushmore and Wall Drug and Badlands. And I remember Mount Rushmore and I remember Wall Drug. What I remember about Badlands is I was futzing with my Walkman. I don't remember what cassette I was listening to. What I paid no attention to, did not notice, is in the midst of that drive, I drove past this very stuff that I now help preserve. And so did millions of other Americans.
Yeah.
And again, another contradiction sort of built into this story.
I want to kind of go back a little bit to the history and the progression of things. One thing, there's a term that I don't think we've quite touched on, although we've discussed it in a roundabout way without giving it this name, of mutually assured destruction, right? MAD. So it kind of characterizes an era of history that is centered around fear. Yeah. Really. So.
And again, it's that central question of what's the best use of a nuclear arsenal? Is it launching it against your enemy, or is it saying, I have this, don't shoot at me today?
Right.
And
which is why we wanted the Soviets to know where everything was, what it was, and the potential for destruction.
Well, and even within the Minuteman story, to this day, to 2018, the Air Force, every year they pull 4 missiles out of silos, pull the warheads, of course, replace them with test dummies, take them to Vandenberg Air Force Base, and launch them into the Pacific to the Kwajalein Atoll. And those weapons tests, they've always had, a sort of a dual purpose. You want to give missile crews practical experience in actually turning keys and launching and seeing it go. And then you just in case any potential adversary of the United States is watching, well, you kind of want them to see, we fired this and it hit what it was going for.
Yep.
And so mutually insured destruction really depends on the threat, but it also depends on, this was an age of 2 superpowers. And there were and there remain other nuclear states. The thing that hasn't actually changed, well, the Soviet Union is gone and the Cold War is considered to be over.
Right.
The United States and Russia are the largest nuclear powers. And the nuclear weapons are really meant as a deterrent against other nuclear weapons states.
Right. Speaking more to this location.
Yeah.
When the facility was constructed, why was it constructed in the middle of South Dakota? Was that?
Well, mutually assured destruction means our weapons are aimed at your weapons. They're also aimed at cities and military targets, but one of the key targets becomes a land-based missile system is a target.
Sure, yeah.
Not a lot of people live here. That's one thing. The other, where are these missiles going? They're going north. And the further north the missiles are, the less distance they have to travel.
Right.
And so geography helps a little bit. That said, in the first full bloom of the development of the missile system, in 1960, the Air Force and the Strategic Air Command approached the Kennedy administration and say, well, we're working on this system. What we need to defend America is 10,000 Minuteman missiles. And Kennedy's Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, 10,000's a little insane, in his opinion. He doesn't feel it's realistic, and it would change the nature of American democracy. And there was some concern built into this time of, to what extent do you create a garrison state in the United States? If we're a free country and they are the militaristic, closed society, we don't want to be that. And McNamara's thought process was, well, ironically, he thought to himself, what we actually need in this system for it to be effective is 400 missiles. But that's too small a number to be politically acceptable, so we'll go to 1,000. Not coincidentally, how many do we have in 2018? 400. So Robert McNamara eventually got his wish. But it's a massive system.
So could you talk a little more about what it would have been like being a missileer? This world is a world run by checklist. The missile officers, everything they do is by checklist. There's a procedure for everything. Everything is done by checklist, and you train on those checklists before you ever pull an alert. And that routine, checklist. This is a world of high security. You have 20-year-olds with top secret clearance. Yeah.
One of our missileers in our oral history interviews, it's hours of boredom followed by seconds of sheer panic, and it's this, again, a contradiction. You can't work in this world and constantly be thinking, oh my gosh, weapons mass destruction, but you never lose sight that is part of this story.
Yeah.
And that's important because for the maintenance workers that are moving missiles, installing warheads, you're handling highly technical equipment, and accidents are bad.
Yeah.
And there again, there are checklists and procedures for changing out any of those pieces of equipment.
Sure.
And they're highly technical. And you always carry those procedures. Those procedures were just part of the world that you lived within.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of character defining to the place. And so when you were in the Launch Control Center, on the deputy's console, there's this, and that's a museum collection object. That's somebody's TO or technical order for the missile system, and it's got little tabs to all the different procedures.
Right.
Because it just lived by checklist. And if you're the topside crew, the day room, you're here for 3 days at a time. You're doing 12-hour shifts. If you're the security police, you have downtime, and so hence the games, the basketball hoop, the volleyball court, the horseshoe pit, the TV.
Right.
If you're a missile officer underground, you're 24 hours. Especially later on, you and your deputy might take turns sleeping, but someone always has to be minding the equipment, minding the communications,
running through those checklists.
But what do you do with that time? And a lot of master's degrees are earned in those control centers.
Yeah,
a lot of master's degrees. Some missileers bring models and make models. You have time to fill, and that's not for everyone. And even within the Air Force, the name Air Force, there's not a lot of air to being 30 feet or more underground in a control center.
Little capsule.
And that was another challenge to this work, is you're contributing every day to the defense of the United States. Hence the name Missile Combat Crew, but nobody sees what you do. And that again, that's fun because this place, people lived. Thousands of people worked in this place for 30 years, 24 hours at a time or 3 days at a time, depending on what part of the building they were. And this space would have been filled with music or television. And that's, history shouldn't simply be how something worked or dates and names. It's the lives of people, how they made sense of what was around them. Yeah. A good story for the day room. I don't think it happened in this particular control center. A friend of mine who was a missile officer, he had this great story. So television usually sat against this wall or in that corner. And so sometime probably in the late 70s, a couple of security police, they're in here. They're watching. They're in the couch and watching TV in the day room. And Delta One reflects the late 80s, so satellite dish. But in the 70s or early 80s, it's bunny ears and 2 or 3 channels. Right. And these guys, it's a winter's night. They're watching TV, and all of a sudden, the screen goes to snow and just static, and one looks at the other, and it's been a pleasure working with you, man. And they shake hands, because by the 70s, you kind of know that what's the first sign of a nuclear war? An electromagnetic burst in the atmosphere of a detonation of a nuclear weapon that essentially fries everything. All electronics stop, except in a place like this that's hardened for it. And then of course the fireballs come after, and that's. That action of, hey, it's been a pleasure working with you, speaks to the gallows humor. How do you live, as watchkeepers of a potential Armageddon? You can't be Chicken Little. You're aware of it, but you compartmentalize it a little bit, and that's true both of missile field staff, during the Cold War. But the other part of our story is this control center is retired, but there are 45 control centers in the northern Great Plains with 90 missile officers underground right now, tending to 400 Minuteman III missiles, on ready alert. And so then to fast forward to the national park, what we do is talk about this every day. And a small part of our visitation are Cold War era veterans who worked in missile fields, and because this place now means they can literally show their families, this is what I did. And that's important. It's also, one of the other functions of national park sites are, as places of civic dialogue, or almost civic literacy. What does it mean to be an American? How do we defend this country? And the answer to that question, when you're standing at Delta 9 looking down, you're in this beautiful landscape. The meadowlarks are singing, the badlands are in the distance, and then you look down, and there's this concrete and steel ultra modern thing that housed a weapon for 30 years, and it wasn't by itself.
80-foot tube.
Yeah.
And only one of many.
Yeah. And so, it's a remarkable place to have conversations with visitors.
So one of the good things to come out of this, I suppose you could say, was exploration of space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have Sputnik, the race to get man to the moon.
Well, that's those other missiles. Minuteman
Right.
was designed with one purpose in mind.
Yeah.
It's a very efficient killing system. That's its purpose. That said, the Minuteman II, what we focus on here, what's in the hole at Delta 9, the guidance computer set on that missile is why we have these. It was a massive step forward in
these
microelectronics.
Cell phones.
Yeah, cell phones.
Yes.
The modern world was born out of that. This era of, the Cold War, the threat of Sputnik and Soviet nuclear weapons was so terrifying that we developed a weapon system that, one, is still being used, and it's been upgradable over decades, and the rush to develop that has led to so many other technologies.
Mm-hmm.
One of the companies involved in the fueling and the construction of the missile, Thiokol, they're the ones that did the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. And so that connects back to the space program. This was a massive springboard for engineering and science,
right,
in the midst of a struggle in which we thought the risks at stake were the survival of the United States itself.
Or indeed the world as a whole. Yeah. High stakes game. You mentioned a little bit earlier about kind of how this project and bringing it into South Dakota affected the people around, the ranchers, as well as kind of some of the protests that may have sprung up later on. Activists generally discovered things through the Freedom of Information Act.
Indeed, they did.
And they start protesting when? In
the late 70s, early 1980s. And 5 of the 6 missile fields had fairly local activist groups.
Yeah.
There was a landowner who owned land right off the end of the runway at Ellsworth Air Force Base and put a giant peace symbol. That's, at a certain point, free expression is to be expected.
Sure.
And not everyone feels the same about these things.
So I think you've spoken to some of the why, but asking you pointedly, why is it important to preserve some might say controversial site like the missile, like Minuteman missile?
Controversy is important. And we shouldn't shy away from the hard parts of American history, because the hard parts are the places, quite frankly, where we can learn the most. This park is a testament, place to explore a question, and that question is, what are the choices we've made as a nation to defend ourselves? And that's worth exploring. Our mission here isn't to tell people what to think about it. It's to give them enough of the story that they can come to their own conclusion. And again, until about 2 years ago, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we'd stopped talking about nuclear weapons. And recent events on the planet Earth have changed the conversation back to nuclear weapons.
It's back in the lexicon for sure.
And there's value in having a place where you explore that story. What are those consequences? What do these weapons mean? What are they for? How are they maintained?
Right.
And one of the greatest pieces, one of the simplest parts of the exhibit area at the visitor center is in the last room. It's the dialogue book, and the panel in front of it, asks, what do you think? Where are we now? And there's a little sheet of paper with some repeats the questions that are elsewhere in the exhibits. Would you turn the key? How would you feel if you had a silo across the street from you? And poses them again. And that dialogue book, again, in a free country, that book allows free expression, and what people say in it is remarkable. It's astounding, especially the children, what children write in it.
Yeah.
And it sometimes it's deeply funny. There are cartoons, and it runs the political gamut of perspective, as it should.
Sure.
And that's providing a space for that isn't simply people shouting at each other is really important. And yet, for the family on the Great American Road Trip, they might not have been thinking of oh, hey, let's on our way to Mount Rushmore, let's stop and talk about nuclear deterrence. And how you talk about this depends on you and how you make sense of it.
Right.
And we spend a lot of time as a staff enabling the staff to listen to people and have the 30-minute tour of Delta One goes pretty fast, and you're focused on the historic structure. The conversations at the visitor center and the exhibits, or at the Delta 9 silo, can be entirely different.
Yeah.
And we let the visitor drive those conversations, and that dialogue is critically important.
So what is it that you hope that visitors take away from the experience?
Well, the most asked question here has tended in the last 3 or 4 years to be some variation of, wait, we gave up we don't have any of these anymore. This is an arsenal that's worked so successfully, nobody knows what it does. And just building that little bit of awareness that there is a nuclear triad, that its function is protection. The semantic debate we had as a staff last summer, we used to talk a lot about, well, the Minuteman missile is a weapon system that's never been used.
Mm-hmm.
That's not actually correct. It's been used every single day since 1962.
Okay.
And so, again, a contradiction. This is a weapon system whose best use is not actually pulling the trigger.
Right.
The constant vigilance, the maintenance of this system at the ready all the time is what it was meant to do.
That's its use, though it's not been deployed.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've been here for 3 years. You have your family here as well, right? And your wife. And what feelings come up when you think of the missile, when you think of Minuteman missile?
Part of my particular career path, before I came here, I worked at Andersonville National Historic Site in South Georgia.
Okay, yeah.
Home of the deadliest place on American soil, where 13,000 United States soldiers lost their lives in a Confederate military prison late in the Civil War. Home also to the American Prisoner of War Museum. I've worked at a number of sites, military history sites of great controversy, sites of great tragedy. My wife would tell you that in 1999, I was at my first full-time job in the National Park Service, so a yeoman park ranger, and late that year, this park gets authorized, and I come home and I'm like, oh man, I want to work there. Now, what I envisioned was being a park ranger and, shaving my hair into a crew cut and doing Dr. Strangelove jokes all day. Be careful what you wish for. And being superintendent of this park has been one of the most satisfying and challenging things I've ever had to do. Mm-hmm. And second only to Andersonville, the park before, where in addition to all those other things, you also operated an active national cemetery burying modern American veterans. Wow. And we'd only been here a couple months, and my daughter at dinner one day, she says, Dad, your park's a nuclear missile. What do you do after that? And 3 years on, I still don't have a good answer to that question. And the other part of that is, what you've seen in this visit. The park was authorized in 1999. Operations began in 2003. We're only really coming into our full bloom in this moment. The visitor center is 3 years old. Exhibits are 2 years old. The park film will debut this summer. The parking lots that will enable visitors to much more easily come and go will be completed this summer. Even a park that everybody wanted to make happen, the Park Service, the Air Force, they take time to develop. And to be present at that creation has been humbling, very satisfying, and fun to watch. Just right before I got here, for a dozen years, the park headquarters, our visitor facility, was 2 trailer houses, 2 single wide trailers. And those days are gone, and visitation has more than doubled. And it's likely with the next year, visitation will double again. Yeah. Because people are here. So many people drive past us every day that the more we develop, the more the word sort of gets out about us. Because now that there is a visitor center, there's something to see that enables more people to at least get a glimpse of the place. Because one of the real preservation and capacity challenges here is the control center at Delta One was built for America's nuclear mission. Right. It was never meant for tourism. And if we ran 1,000 people through this building in a day, it would risk the building in multiple ways. And the best embodiment of that is the elevator. That probably felt very comfortable.
Yeah, it's cozy with 6 of you.
It's 3 by 5 feet. Yeah. And it all that hardware is original to 1962. carpeting on the walls is later 80s.
Okay.
But the Air Force probably ran that elevator 3 or 4 times a day at most.
Right.
Every tour is 2 rides. And we spend quite a bit of money, and of course we do, on quarterly maintenance checks and annual maintenance on that elevator, because without the elevator, the tour is not as cool. And then even the control center is this really tight space. We say, watch your feet, watch your feet, watch your head multiple times as you go into that space, because it was meant for 2 officers who knew exactly what they were doing, knew what to expect. It wasn't meant for the public to see.
Yeah.
So our capacity for tours is very small. If you're coming here, please reserve your tour in advance, or come in the spring and fall when tours are in less of a demand.
Yeah, on the shoulder season.
Yeah, that shoulder season is pretty important. And so the visitor center, serves a really important purpose in that it provides everyone something to see, and that frame of reference. All those exhibits, again, much of our conversation, all that's covered in the exhibits. The Cold War context, the how does the missile system work? It's all there in exhibit form. So kind of the 5,000-foot level.
Yeah.
In terms of complexity.
Yeah. And yet there is so much there to go through and kind of process and put in context. I mean, we're talking several decades.
Yeah.
It is one of the better exhibits we've seen at a park. And
park film that's coming online this summer, that I've spent more than, at this point, 3.5 years of my life in getting done. And it doesn't entirely repeat the exhibits, but it's understanding that people have different learning styles or different ways of experiencing a place. The film serves a very important function, and that film, like the exhibits, talks about that historic past, and then at the end pivots and says, we still do this. Missiles still stand at the ready. And that was, after having been here a couple of years, we needed to end there. We didn't need to say, oh, this is all over and everything's fine.
Right.
And that film I'm really excited to share.
So going big picture then, before we wrap up, what's the importance of the national park system as a whole to you?
Well, so earlier you counted 60 national parks, capital N, capital P.
Right.
I grew up in Yellowstone. I've worked in Big Bend National Park. I prefer national park with the lowercase. Everything, regardless of its designation, if it's administered by the National Park Service, it's in the national park system. There's over 400 of them now, which is great because this is a really complicated country. The biological complexity, the natural complexity of this nation is just astounding. This continent is a gift, and that complexity of all those parks with all those different stories. This is a place to explore America. For me, a visit to a national park is successful. Any size, any complexity, if that during that visit you look at America in a way you've never seen it before.
Sometimes that can be as simple as just the natural splendor. Other times it can get you thinking about who we are.
And it's a free country. Everyone comes to this with what they already have and how they're going to process things. And that's part, the complexity of the system, the fact that these parks are so different, and yet they're managed within the same broad construct is remarkable. National parks are an American invention, and we try to be very good at what we created. And this one, this is certainly the first national park dedicated to the Cold War, the late 20th century story. And again, one of the fun challenges here is our old, the furniture in the day room. Those magazines are 1992 and 1993. They're a
lot more contemporary.
Yeah, to my kids they're old, but to us they're not old.
Superintendent Eric said, "A visit to a national park is successful if, during that visit, you look at America in a way you've never seen it before." This struck us deeply. My wife Sarah and I were born at the end of the Cold War and had a lot to learn about the history. We didn't know what to expect going into the park. However, it's the conversations after our visit, in the car, where the real integration of new knowledge began. We encourage you to visit the national parks with a small p, because you'll learn about our history as a country and perhaps a bit about yourself too. It could lead your family to discuss the difficult topics of history as they relate to your own lives. Oftentimes, that's where the real learning begins. For more discussions with Ranger Eric about the Cold War coming to a close, missile site protests, and Eric's Apocalypse music playlist, join our Patreon community. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. A link is posted in our show notes or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. You can also help us out by leaving a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider to help us improve the show. Stay with us through the final minutes for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. All of our public lands are in search of volunteers, whether it's with the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, or the National Park Service, which includes Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. There's probably a volunteer opportunity in your area. Find out more information by visiting volunteer.gov. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, like you. Coming up in episode 12 of Podcasts with Park Rangers, we travel to Badlands National Park and talk with paleontologist Ed Welsh. Let's go back in time and discover why the park has one of the largest mammalian fossil caches in the world, and how you as a visitor can discover fossils too.